One of the reasons I think the Putin chef moniker is so important, yes, he doesn't actually make Putin's meals, but he is a state-sanctioned caterer. And if you've noticed, Putin seems to have a really strong aversion to food. He won't drink water or eat food at foreign events, for example, because he fears poisoning. So but for now, I think I'm gonna do maybe this Putin's secret private army, the Wagner Group, because I actually know a little bit about this from another source. So I'd love to see his take on it.
Small groups of men start arriving in Ukraine from Africa. They're there on holiday to visit family, to see their friends, whatever sounds most believable. They speak Ukrainian, they look Ukrainian, some even carry Ukrainian passports. They blend in perfectly. Except, nothing I told you about these men is true. They're not Ukrainian, they're not students or businessmen coming to visit their friends and family. They're undercover Russian mercenaries, paid fighters, and their objective? To assassinate Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to cut off the head of the Ukrainian government. Whoever could kill
Okay. All right, I'm just gonna point this out. So, all right, let's just let this play out.
Zelensky first will receive a very large bounty and return to Russia as a hero. These soldiers who look and sound Ukrainian work for a company called the Wagner Group. If you never heard of the Wagner Group before, it's for a good reason. It's a secretive private military contractor. But not just any private army. These soldiers are unmarked, anonymous. They fly no flag. Many of them are ex-Russian special forces. And rumor has it, the Wagner Group works on behalf of the Russian government whenever Putin wants a little bit more plausible deniability. And for an entire 5 weeks before Russia officially invaded Ukraine, 400 of these Wagner mercenaries were already operating behind enemy lines. These assassins wasted no time. In less than a week after the invasion started, Zelensky avoided 3 assassination attempts, with 2 of those coming from Wagner mercenaries. Besides destabilizing the Ukrainian government, these mercenaries have been doing the Kremlin's bidding all over the world.
Okay, so, all right, I'm going to point this out. The Wagner Group, okay. The Wagner Group is a very unique organization for a bunch of reasons. First off, yes, it is a ostensibly civilian organization that is meant to give Putin another layer of plausible deniability in his military operations, though they're very, very, very closely tied to the military. The Wagner Group's headquarters, for example, is actually on the same military base as the VDV, but the Wagner Group, right, you take like a left after the checkpoint to get to Wagner Group and a right to get to, you know, the regular uniformed flagged Russian military. So it's very, very similar, but the reputation is that is a lot like the rest of the Russian military, right? They market themselves as being ex-special forces, combat veterans, other sort of adventure, experienced senior police officers, people who have a lot of relevant experience join the Wagner Group, and that they are sent to primarily do a training mission, sometimes occasional combat type missions in places like Syria and the DRC. In Syria, of course, they famously tried to secure an oil field and actually came at one point into contact with U.S. forces, and it did not go well for them. But I think it's really worth noting that the reputation is that corruption, even in the Wagner Group, eventually ground them out. The pace of operations was very fast. Most of the experienced troops supposedly got fed up with the level of ineptitude. Supposedly, a lot of the pay was siphoned off by their leadership, leaving very little left for the actual combatants themselves. A lot of promised pay never materialized, a lot of promised support. And so most of their combat troops are either dead, wounded, or have left the unit in frustration. And so now, supposedly, they are just recruiting far, far less qualified people. Conscripts who finished their service, sometimes even just sort of motorcycle gang members and other just sort of generic tough guys. Not a lot of screening, not a lot of proof of real combat experience that you would want in a unit like this. And that's probably a good reason why, despite having a 5-week advance notice, and the fact that Zelensky kind of dismissed the reports that Russia was going to invade, they still weren't able to successfully complete the assassination attempt. And yeah, if you're like, wow, this sounds a lot like the regular Russian army, it's probably because they have the same endemic issues, which is a frightening, disturbing level of corruption.
Including Syria, Sudan, all over Africa, Libya,
Syria, okay, Sudan is in Africa, but
Venezuela,
continue.
Mozambique, and more.
Also, Mozambique's in Africa.
Since they're unmarked, they don't have to worry about human rights or collateral damage, leaving a trail of war crimes behind them. This is the Wagner Group,
okay,
the most secretive private military in the world, also known as Russia's ghost soldiers.
Yeah, I gotta see if this is like research or if it's just meant to be hype. Because here's the thing, they do all the things that you would expect from like the badass PMC of a video game, right? But again, just like the Russian military that is a 9 out of 10 in terms of selling itself and is like a 2 out of 10 in terms of fighting a war, I think the Wagner Group is the same thing. In terms of their international reputation, top of the line. There's a great, I think it was a Vice News article talking about the Wagner Group's mission to train security forces in Congo, because the European Union's efforts to train the Congolese military, the DRC, was just a total failure. The European militaries couldn't even get permission to export arms, so they had to train the Congolese soldiers on wooden cutouts of weapons, which if your goal is to stand up a force capable of fighting an armed insurgency, that is not the place to do it. So Wagner steps in, and they have access to weapons, troops, good training methods, and the DRC is reportedly like happy with the result. But I'll also say, you see some of the pictures and then you're just like, these are not US style like ex special forces. They're a little soft around the midsection and such.
If you watch this channel, you're probably an ambitious person. And as an ambitious person, you probably have crypto and digital wallets that you need to protect. And for good reason. Cyber attacks prevent push notifications family members on one account. And for free security, private military contractors or PMCs are nothing new. Blackwater, now known as Academy, was the most well-known controversial American PMC in the world.
Okay, well, that's just regular soldiers.
We have a video on them. The main difference between Blackwater and the Wagner Group is that the Wagner Group doesn't technically exist. As far as we know, it's led by a guy named Dmitry Yutkin, an ex-Russian Special Forces officer. He's rumored to be a neo-Nazi and a die-hard Hitler fan.
Whoa, come on, man. You can't be putting this on the channel.
He says to name his company after Wagner as well. But like I said, the Wagner Group as a PMC doesn't actually exist in Russia. It's actually illegal to run a private military contractor company in Russia, so instead the Wagner Group is registered in Argentina. And instead of having employees, Wagner is just an umbrella name for dozens of different Russian PMCs who get their money from one guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Also known as Putin's chef, yes, like an actual cooking chef. Yevgeny Prigozhin is a Russian oligarch and a recent addition to the FBI's most wanted list.
Yeah, this is probably more accurate. And also, one of the reasons I think the Putin chef moniker is so important, yes, he doesn't actually make Putin's meals, but he is a state-sanctioned caterer. And if you've noticed, Putin seems to have a really strong aversion to food. He won't drink water or eat food at foreign events, for example, because he fears poisoning. So having someone who he trusts immensely, right, a sign of a tremendous level of trust, is giving that person access to your food, since that seems to be a facet where Putin expects to most likely be harmed.
He is believed to be the real owner of the Wagner Group, although he's always denied any association for obvious reasons. He is the money man, and wherever Wagner goes, Prigozhin profits. Together, Yutkin and Prigozhin created this organization of Russian mercenaries to do whatever the Russian government needs them to do. They get a lot of money, and Putin avoids getting accused of committing acts of war against sovereign countries. PMCs are illegal in Russia, remember? The Russian government obviously can't be held responsible for something an illegal organization did, plus the Wagner Group is—
Yep. This is how a lot of these things work. I mean, I don't think the U.S. has its own version of that. I think the times where the U.S. has sort of tried to construct that. The US did that a lot in the 60s and 70s in an attempt to distance themselves from military interventions. But those people were reportedly unbelievably unreliable, much like the Wagner Group, right? The same thing the Russians are kind of learning now is that those sort of people, if you're willing to kill for money, you're probably on some fundamental, if you're willing to kill just purely for money, you're on some fundamental level a piece of shit. And the like old mercenary companies of, the executive outcome days or whatever, yeah, those guys were just pieces of shit.
Isn't even registered in Russia. The connection between the Russian
And they're seeing that too in the Wagner Group, right? At every level, the chain of command's just sort of shitbags.
government and Wagner is hazy at most. Except for the fact that the Wagner Group regularly uses Russian military aircraft, its mercenaries get treated in Russian military hospitals, and Yevgeny Prigozhin and Vladimir Putin are pretty much best friends. The Wagner Group is there for Putin to outsource his dirty work, and their very first job for him was right where they are today, Ukraine.
Okay, I'm curious his assessment here, because if he's going to say that the Wagner Group was the Little Green Men, I think that's wrong.
February 20, 2014, Russian troops crossed the border into Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula. They're here to stake Russia's claim on the territory. Luckily, most residents of Crimea are Russian, so they don't pose a threat. But in between the sea of smiling Russian soldiers in marked uniforms were men in plain green unmarked uniforms. They're not smiling as they move through the cities, securing borders and checkpoints. In fact, their faces are completely covered. These were the original Wagner mercenaries, later called Little Green Men because of their unmarked uniforms.
Okay, I believe... All right, so these guys I don't think are considered Wagner mercenaries. They may have been the prototype, but they were ostensibly volunteers, but they were very clearly linked to Russian VDV. They were just elite Russian troops, or sort of like highly trained airborne troopers that just engaged in this weird seizure with obviously their rank patches and stuff stripped off. I mean, as discussed, the Wagner Group doesn't actually command any men. So yeah, I think this may have been the genesis of the idea, but I don't think it's fair to say these were Wagner Group. This was just literally an unmarked airborne battalion.
There to make sure nothing goes wrong. Luckily, the takeover of Crimea was effortless, but in case things got out of hand, the Wagner Group was there to do what official Russian soldiers couldn't, to make sure that at any cost, Russia didn't lose. Dmitry Yukin was one of those green men back in 2014. After they took over Crimea, war broke out in the eastern region of Ukraine, Donbass, and around 300 mercenaries moved from Crimea to Donbass.
Remember, 300 of these guys is not that many.
Were Putin's insurance, his backup plan if anyone showed any sort of resistance. They stayed in Ukraine for almost a year, waiting for something to go wrong, for a chance to get in the fights, but they wouldn't get their chance until 2015, when Putin suddenly needed help in Syria.
Okay, I could believe there were like 300 or so in Crimea and Donbass, but I mean, we just saw from the footage there more than 300 of the Little Green Men. So I imagine they were probably on some sort of like backup secondary or VIP security or something like that. The ghost soldiers of Syria.
Hamdi Buta was not the kind of man to look for trouble. When things in Syria started getting bad in 2011, he decided to cut his losses and flee to Lebanon. His wife and children would be safe in Syria, but if he stayed, there was a chance he would be forced to join the Syrian army and fight against the rebels. If he was forced to fight, who would care for his kids? Who would make sure they had money? So for almost 6 years, he stayed put in Lebanon away from his family, regularly sending money to his wife and dreaming of the day he could go back home. Then, right before a major religious holiday in 2017, his mother died. And being a family man, he decided it was time to visit home. Except he never got a chance to do any of that. Instead, as he reached the capital of Syria, Damascus, he was detained by Syrian soldiers. When they found out he fled in 2011, they informed him that he would have to join the army. His worst fears were coming true. He would have to fight against his own countrymen, and no one would be there to take care of his family. So,
yeah, this is, yeah.
He hatched a plan. Once he reached the army base, he would just run. He didn't know the area well, but he didn't care. He would just keep running until he found someone who could help. And that's exactly what he did. The only problem was, Hamdi underestimated how far he had to run. but he kept going, exhausted and dehydrated.
Okay, this is like a long story, and I don't know where this is going. Otherwise, I would have something to say about this.
Until he saw a camp in the distance. He was saved, he was gonna make it. Relief flooded his body as he ran into
Okay,
the
man.
camp, calling out in Arabic, the only language he knew. Except the people in the camp weren't Syrian. In fact, they weren't Arabic at all. They spoke
Arabic.
a language he couldn't understand and pointed guns in his face. Hamdi had just stumbled into a Wagner Group camp outside of the Al-Shur gas plant. You see, 2 years earlier, Russia had made it.
Yeah, okay. Wow, that was a long time to just say the Wagner Group had a camp in the gas plant. Yeah, so let's take a look at these guys back here. So this was, I think, probably the heyday of the, let's see. I love pointing guns in the face. Okay, let's see. All right, so you're looking at, you can see here on the left, this guy's got a Gorka 3 uniform. This is commercially available. Nothing that fancy. Then you have some like khaki uniforms here. This is the big Russian style helmet. Here's looks like an older Russian helmet. Yeah, and this looks like a nice plate carrier, but it's not clear that this guy has a plate carrier at all. Yeah, this is a weird mishmash of uniforms. I'm continually shocked that some people have more equipment than others. Especially essential stuff like plate carriers. Not seeing any night vision. In fact, I'm not seeing any helmets equipped for night vision operations. All this sort of makes me think that if this really is a photo of the Wagner Group, that they're not the high-level professionals that we think they are. Again, a lot of just amateurish wannabe stuff, and a lot of just like mishmash.
Went into a Wagner Group camp outside of the Al-Shur gas plant. In the Al-Shur plants, where the Wagner Group was stationed, had become a cash cow for a company called Evropolis. Coincidentally, Evropolis is directly linked to none other than Yevgeny Prigozhin, the owner of the Wagner Group. So when Hamdi Buta ran into their camp that day, he could have never expected what would happen next. Instead of helping him trying to understand his story, or even just arresting him, the Wagner mercenaries did much worse. They accused him of being part of ISIS. Their justification? He could only speak Arabic. What happened next is sickening, so sickening that I can't talk about it on YouTube, or else we will get demonetized. You can read it for yourself by searching Hamdi Buta's name. In the end, Hamdi Buta was brutally killed, treated in the same way terrorists treated Westerners, and it was all caught on camera. A camera held by a Wagner mercenary as they tortured a completely innocent man. All of that for around $4,000 a month, while Russia claims it's only giving Syria aerial supports.
Yeah, okay, $4,000 a month is actually pretty good in terms of Russian salaries. It's the equivalent of like a major. Yeah, I mean, I've seen what U.S. contractors make. We had some contractors with us that when I was deployed, and they were actually armed. They were police training experts, which now you're like, but you guys were military police. Everybody who was working with the police got a police training expert. So they were really cool. They kind of rolled their eyes, but they were consummate professionals, badass in their own right, and probably made, I think they were making $100,000 a year tax-free. So a good salary, especially for 10 years ago.
The EU Council later found Dmitry Yukin had personally ordered the mercenaries to do what they did and get it on camera, and Syria was not their only customer. Who do you call when you just overthrown your country's government and need to make sure your coup doesn't get couped? That you won't just get overthrown by someone else while there's still a power vacuum. You call the Wagner Group, of course. Just like President Assad of Syria, the governments of African countries like Mali, Sudan, and the Central African Republic, they all use Wagner mercenaries
Which is weird because the French have been really involved in Mali.
to stay in power.
Really involved.
Wagner mercenaries first touched down in the Central African Republic, or CAR, in 2017. The CAR has been at war with itself for years. Every few months there's a new coup attempt. Every year there's opportunity for a civil war. And for years, the main military force in the area were UN peacekeeping troops. Unfortunately for them, by 2017, they had not kept much peace or done anything to stabilize the governments. So the president of the
Yeah, this is one of the things that why the US does not do peacekeeping with the UN is because oftentimes they are so bureaucratically constrained that sometimes they even don't have the right to self-defense. This is why the US has said we will never send our troops into a situation where they do not have the right to use lethal force to protect themselves from attacks. And the UN is not subject to this, but oftentimes, unfortunately, they try to launch these counterinsurgency operations, but that's just not what they're there to do. And they're pretty terrible at it. Also, oftentimes these soldiers that make up UN peacekeeping forces are from countries where the salary is so low that the only way those militaries can maintain their readiness levels, even a basic level of readiness, is to actually farm those soldiers out to UN peacekeeping missions. So think like Bangladeshi soldiers or Indonesian. So I don't even think the Indonesian soldiers, right? Haitian soldiers, maybe. Probably not Haitians. But you know what I mean. Extremely impoverished countries make up a lot of them.
CAR decided to turn to Russia. It was time to call in the big dogs. So Wagner arrived in the CAR to train his army, boost their security, commit a few war crimes in the process, and make a lot of money for its founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Around 2,000 Wagner mercenaries were stationed in the CAR, but instead of fighting against armed troops,
okay, those are French.
they're mostly there to serve Russia's financial interests and their own bloodlust. In fact, the mercenaries often work with the people.
Okay, I think these guys are actually Wagner Group people. This guy looks like he may actually, he's got the build of somebody who might have been
they're supposed to be fighting against
doing
to
a
buy
little work.
locally mined diamonds instead. It's no secret who is profiting. In 2021, the CAR Prime Minister flew to Russia on Prigozhin's own private jets. All over Africa, Russian companies like those owned by Prigozhin are profiting big time from Wagner's expansion. Oil, diamonds, coal, gold, you name it, and guys like Prigozhin have their fingers all over it. It's one of the reasons why African countries are so slow to call out Russia for invading Ukraine, and why people like Jacob Zuma, ex-president of South Africa, post stuff like this on Twitter, even calling Putin a man of peace.
Yeah, none of this shocks me. I mean, it's funny when you see it, though it's worth noting that, you know, there's unfortunately some politicians here in the United States that also operate this way.
Russia's support, even at the expense of their own people and resources, is too valuable to lose.
Yeah, what's sort of crazy is that a lot of people thought that because the Russian military was spending so much time doing operations in these countries, that their military would achieve a certain level of diffusion, right? This is sort of how the U.S. military has gotten better over time. And someone points out in chat, Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Rwanda, and Ethiopia are the top 5 contributors to UN peacekeeping. Yep, makes sense. So you have, so there was this idea that this experience, this operational experience, would diffuse out over time, and that just the process of deploying, doing an operation, and redeploying was complex enough that the leadership of these units that engaged in it would gain this operational experience and would then get transferred from unit to unit, making their whole army better, right? Sharing their experience, sharing their expertise in sort of how modern warfare might look. But this doesn't appear to have happened in Russia, or again, corruption has just sort of stifled it massively.
In 2018, 3 Russian journalists traveled to the CAR for a very special project, to investigate what the Wagner Group has been up to in the country.
He loves movie clips.
They went in expecting to get a small glimpse of how Putin's private army operated. They were going to share this information with the world, and lift the veil off of one of the most ruthless and feared PMCs in the world, but they never got the chance. 3 days after their arrival, the 3 journalists were on their way to meet a source, but then, a group of men appeared out of nowhere and opened fire on their car. It was an ambush. The 3 journalists were dead in an instant. People expected public outcry. Russia is famous for making big waves whenever Russian citizens are harmed or killed overseas. But none of that happened. Instead, the Russian government came out with a news story. These 3 journalists had no authorization to be in the CAR. They hadn't gotten approval or support from the Russian forces in the CAR. They had gone in blind and they knew it. It wasn't Russia's fault. They couldn't help people who didn't follow the right channels. The 3 journalists were supposed to take protection from the same people they were investigating, and the government of the CAR also deflected the story.
I love this like corrupt government. It's just pics of old US politicians.
First, the government claimed the journalists were killed by roadside robbers. Then their driver, who survived the attack, pretty much fell off the face of the earth. And to top it all off, Russia then put all the blame on the man who funded their journalism trip, none other than Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And if you've watched our video on Russian oligarchs, you would know that Mikhail Khodorkovsky was a Russian oil tycoon who made billions. But then a couple years into his reign as Russia's richest man, he decided to take on Vladimir Putin for corruption. In exchange, he got sent to jail, then a labor camp, had all of his wealth destroyed, and now lives in exile in Switzerland. Mikhail always had it out for Putin and his government. Maybe
Yep. That's actually pretty funny.
investigating the Wagner Group was how he hoped to stick it to Putin.
That he wanted to just take over from Putin.
Luckily for Russia, the journalist never got the chance to uncover anything. Murdered on a busy road where no one else was attacked for weeks before or after that. For all we know about the war crimes Wagner mercenaries commit, there's very little we actually know about his tactics or how it operates.
Yeah, all his wealth destroyed. Listen, if you're rich, if you're that level of rich, you have many insurance policies, probably ranging from untraceable Bitcoin accounts, to condos in other cities, to shell companies that aren't really detectable, to literally probably just buried troves of gold, or other assets, right? There's always abilities to secure your wealth more and more and more tightly in the event something like this happens.
In the countries it visits. The Wagner Group is the world's most bloodthirsty secretive PMC, and they're not going to give up that title anytime soon.
All right, ultimately, guys, I think he exaggerated a little bit. I think the Wagner Group has been shown to not be that effective. But all he has left is his poor $5 billion. Poor guys. That's it, bucko. You lost your gravity privileges. Yep, someone turned off his gravity generator. Falling off the face. Now, falling off the face of the earth is usually a euphemism for killed and but no body has been found.
So I said, no, it was supposed to be my pentakill. What did you do to me? I killed, I know, 1, 2, 3 for champion.